Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure to have you join this insightful webinar. And today we are really excited to be focusing on the theme of leveraging ecosystem players and platforms to scale evidence use. So we will be sharing insights from our work emerging from three countries, that is Cameroon, Kenya, and Malawi. My name is Aisel Kipruta. I'm the head of communications at Education Sub-Saharan Africa, or ESSA, and really happy to have you join us today. So before we continue, I just wanted to make a few notes. First, the session is recorded, so that will enable us to share this webinar with you afterwards. So by participating, you consent to being recorded. And if you have a concern with that, please let us know in the chat function. We will use the Q&A function for questions, and we will disable the chat function to enable us to really focus or direct our questions to Q&A function. And that will enable us to interact well with the panelists. So why are we here today? The Unlocking Data Initiative is a community of practice that connects African scholars, non-governmental organizations, national statistic offices, and policymakers to improve access and use of education data. So really, that's the topic that we want to dive deeply today. So one of the key projects that we are currently implementing is scaling users and users of education data. And this is led by Zizi Afrique Foundation with support from eBase, EdTech Hub, ESSA, and the University of Malawi. So the project is implemented in three countries. As I said earlier on, that we are going to get insights from these countries, Cameroon, Kenya, and Malawi. And this project aims to expand the uses of existing data by policymakers and also researchers. And really the aim is to bridge the knowledge gap. So may I request my colleague Gillian to just post the link to the project page so that people can get to know more about this project that we are implementing. So to start us off, I can see already we have 77 people and more joining. There was a lot of interest to this webinar. I think over 200 people had already expressed interest, and we would really love to know where you are joining from. So Jillian will launch a poll. So take a moment to let us know where you are joining from. That is your country. We want to know your relation to the data ecosystem in your country. We also want to know what you expect to get from this conversation. So I'll pause here for a minute to just allow you to share with us. Yeah, I can see people continuing to post from where they are joining from. I can see Kenya, we have Zimbabwe, Rwanda, Cameroon. Yeah, keep them coming. Really interested to see where we are all joining from. I can also see my colleagues from ESSA, VVOB, Kenya, APHRC. Yeah, a number of organizations, really. Yeah, so thank you. I can see great participation from different countries. And really thank you for making the time to join the conversation. Because of time, I will not go through all the comments on chats. And yeah, I'm certain that we are all looking forward to this discussion. So we now want to we want to move to the next session. I can see my colleague is sharing the data here. You can all see um, your relation to the data ecosystem. Some people are data generators, um, yeah, data users. Great. Jillian, I don't know if you want to highlight all the questions for just all of us to see where we are joining from, the relation with data ecosystem and all that.
I think this is visible mostly to us, but we see lots of you are data generators from donor CSO or NGOs, data generators, research or think tanks. Most welcome, and I hope you enjoy the session.
Great. Thank you, Jillian. So I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists, and today we are really happy to have Rigobert Bambe, we have Dr. Charles Kashoki, we have Esme Kadzamira, and forgive me if I pronounce your name wrongly. I will do my best to pronounce it in the correct way. So I just want to really tell you who they are, and yeah, we look forward to a fruitful conversation. So to start with our first panelist, we have Rigobert Bambe, who is currently the deputy lead of programs at EBS Africa. He is a TVET teacher and education researcher, focusing on evidence generation, synthesis, implementation, and dissemination. An advocate for data-driven decision-making, he believes in a future where African leaders make decisions based on evidence produced by researchers who understand our environmental settings. You can see Rigobert on the screen. Our second panelist is Dr. Charles Kashoki. He holds a PhD in economics from Kenyatta University, Kenya, Masters of Arts in Economic Policy Management, and a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Economics from University of Nairobi. He possesses a wide range of skills in economic governance and accountability, monitoring and evaluation, research and analysis, and previously he taught at Kenyatta University in the School of Economics. He has also worked as a senior economist at Kenya National Examination Council, NEC, and has also been the head of monitoring and evaluation at the Kenya Forest Service. Currently is the manager evidence synthesis and translation at Zizi Afrique Foundation. Zizi Afrique Foundation is leading on this project of unlocking data. Then we have Esme Kadzamira, who is a research fellow at the Center of Education and Training at the University of Malawi. She's a seasoned educational researcher and policy analyst, specializing on foundational, basic, and secondary education. Her research focuses on equitable access to education, determinants of schooling, learning outcomes, education outcomes, and data accessibility. She advocates for evidence-based policies, open data, and equitable education. So on the screen, you can see our esteemed panelists. Thank you so much. We also have Nariman Mustafa, who is a researcher at EdTech Hub, and she's going to moderate the panel session. So she will be spending a few minutes to tell us about herself before she dives into the conversation. In the background, we have Jillian from EdTech Hub, and also we have Latte, who is Dr. Latte, who is going to be supporting us with the question session. So thank you so much, and over to you, Nariman.
Thank you so much, Aisel. Welcome everyone from all over the world. It's an honor to have you all. My name is Nariman Mustafa, and I am a senior researcher at the EdTech Hub. EdTech Hub is a consortium for evidence-based policymaking on education technologies. I'm also the community learning lead for the Unlocking Data Initiative. And this is such an honor. It means I have the privilege of working with Unlocking Data partners and consortia in Kenya and Cameroon and Malawi, the different stakeholders that all of these countries convene, whether it's of development partners, NGOs and CSOs, researchers and government officers that are engaged in our Unlocking Data Initiative in these countries. I also have the privilege of to be thinking and planning and creating possibilities for larger involvement in sub-Saharan Africa for unlocking data, increasing the generation and the usage of data, along with our partners, Education Sub-Saharan Africa, or ESSA. Now, this webinar is a part of ongoing activities of this community of learning that we hope to keep expanding and learning with and from. The webinar actually comes at a time where it's the occasion of publishing 4 reports from the Unlocking Data Initiative. 3 of these reports are situational analyses on the status of foundational learning data and data ecosystems in each of the 3 participating countries in Unlocking Data, Kenya, Cameroon, and Malawi. And the 4th report is a cross-country report that uses a political economy analysis to compare and contrast, see similarities and differences, especially when it comes to power dynamics around data ecosystems in these 3 countries. And I hope that this webinar would entice you enough and would give you a really good teaser to go ahead and to read these reports, which are open source, and they are on our website and our evidence library. And my colleague Jill is just going to put for you links to all of them. Don't read them now. We will post them again at the end of the webinar, and hopefully we'll give you teasers of all of them during the webinar. I would also really hope that this webinar would entice you to think about joining and keeping updated with the work of the Unlocking Data Initiative. There are multiple ways of engagement, so I encourage you to stay until the end of the session where I can mention all of these ways of engagement. So without further ado, I'd like to kickstart our conversation with our panelists here. And we're going to be discussing today different themes, whether it's related to the status of foundational learning data and data ecosystems, the status of stakeholders, the flow of information, the gaps and the barriers, as well as the opportunities. So to start with, and let's give us the lay of the land, really to try and understand the data landscape in foundational learning. And I will start the first question with Rigobert, if you can come on video. So Rigobert, it would be amazing if you can share with us, what does the data actually tell us about the current state of foundational learning, starting with Cameroon?
Thank you, Nariman, for giving me the floor. I think before I even talk about provide some insight on what the data actually says, is to actually define foundational learning itself within within the context of Cameroon. And the first challenge we found out was that foundational learning doesn't have a clear definition within policy and practice in Cameroon. I mean, there is a broader definition of foundational learning that actually involves kindergarten, primary education, and lower secondary education. But for the purpose of this work, we narrowed the definition of foundational learning to kindergarten and basic education. So what we found out was that there are strong policies that are governing foundational learning in Cameroon, and it's even instituted within the country's institution, and also all the policies that are being developed by the ministries to promote education in Cameroon. However, there are challenges with implementation of these policies, specifically in challenge areas where we have some conflicts, like in the northern part of Cameroon with Boko Haram, in the southwest and northwest region of Cameroon with some insurgencies. So there are challenges with implementation of these policies. However, all the education stakeholders in Cameroon are doing tremendous work within the foundational learning sector. And the challenge is actually the lack of synergy within these actors. So I'm talking about the state actors, I'm talking about policymakers at national and subnational level, I'm talking about the CSOs, I'm talking about the schools, I'm talking about the teachers. All of them are doing tremendous work to improve foundational learning, but there is very little synergy. For instance, we're not able to find, there were limited data, limited evidence on foundational learning or research conducted on foundational learning in Cameroon. And the universities also were not very involved in this, with very limited research we could find on their desks. Most of the research or most of the evidence we found on foundational learning were actually focused on literacy, or on at the lesser way on the teacher's professional development. But areas like numeracy, social and emotional learning, inclusive education were highly neglected. Publications also were largely done by men and were largely done in English, with Cameroon being a bilingual country. But our key takeaway was actually the huge level of mistrust that exists between different education stakeholders, with researchers not trusting data coming from the state because they believe that it may be politically motivated. And with the state not really, or some state actors not really believing or trusting data coming from researchers from the universities because they are not sure of the quality of that work. So yeah, in the nutshell, those are some key highlights we found out from our study.
Appreciate it, Rigo. And we'll go more into some of these barriers and challenges as well. I think very insightful what you're saying about trust and research coming from men and in English. I would love to go to Esme next, thinking about Malawi. And Esme, if you can shed some light on what has actually been researched in foundational learning, what is the focus of the evidence, and why are some areas neglected or receiving less attentions, and what are those areas from the work that you've done on analyzing situation of data ecosystems in Malawi?
Thank you very much, Nariman. In Malawi, the evidence that we have available, that we were able to map, shows that much of the work, the evidence is focusing on the policy area of quality, and other areas that educational policy, prioritizes, like relevance, equity, access. There was hardly any literature that was available. And also, maybe similar to what is happening in Cameroon, in Malawi, there's very little evidence on preschool. And to say this again, in Malawi, it's unique in that foundational learning is located in two ministries, and there's very little collaboration between the two ministries. So Ministry of Gender, Community Development, and Social Welfare is responsible for early childhood education, whilst Ministry of Education is basic and the other levels of education. So that, there is a disjuncture about what is happening in early childhood and what is happening in primary education. So in terms of also, the evidence that is available, the reason why maybe we were only able to map limited evidence on foundational learning in Malawi is that we encountered, as we were collecting the data, resistance from researchers to share their research that they have that they had carried out, even from university community, to share the evidence. There's people think that maybe you're going to plagiarize their work and things like that. So they want to share their work, which limits the amount of evidence that is available for decision making. Because if researchers keep on conducting research, publishing, and yet the work is not shared, it means policymakers are unable to use that evidence in decision making. And also, the other thing is that, the evidence, the data, when we look at data, the data that is available across government, across universities is siloed. So within the Ministry of Education, although some of the data is centralized within the EMIS system, much of the other data, for example, learning outcomes, is held by another department. And if researchers want to access that data, they face bureaucratic challenges in accessing the data. So because of this, it also limits the amount of evidence that can be generated from existing data sets. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it, Esme. Very complex what you're describing. And I know that Charles will only add to this complexity by telling us more about the stakeholder landscape and the general, of course, data landscape, but also I know you'll bring in more about stakeholders and power dynamics between them, Charles, in Kenya.
Thank you, Nariman, and my colleagues from Cameroon and Malawi, and all the consortium members. I think the scenario is coming out as, you know, more so the same across the region, considering that we are in this region. Here we are talking about ages 4 to 10. In Kenyan context, just like Rigobert said, we are talking about ages 4 to 10, that is PP1 in Kenya, PP2, and up to grade 5 in Kenya. When you talk about stakeholders, that already covers two key stakeholders, the county governments and the national government. The county government is in charge of ECD, that is PP1 and PP2, and then we have the primary one going up. And that already creates a big, you know, there's a big disjoint on how things are done. Yet this factory called pre-primary is what feeds the basic education. It's still not clear why pre-primary is not part of basic education, such that the two stakeholders don't really seem to work in convergence. So I think that's one thing. It's good to mention those two stakeholders. The other set of stakeholders is the academia, the ministry itself, the subnationals, and independent researchers and CSOs. The power dynamics around there is that if World Bank asks data from the ministry, World Bank will get data. If EndTech asks for data from the same ministry, you have challenges getting the data. So there's power imbalance in such that who asks for data gets data. So you'll likely see that researchers will quote data from World Bank, not from the ministry, but the World Bank has a caveat saying this data was sourced from the Ministry of Education. So it's quite dynamic. And again, as Rigobert said, part of it is trust. The government thinks that they can't trust data from certain stakeholders, for instance, the CSOs and NGOs and academia. Governments want to use its own data. And this data is normally in task force reports, administrative reports, which are in files, again, not in the open. So those are the power dynamics I see here, that sometimes even government asks for data from schools, but the flow back to schools is not really easy. Even within the ministry, you realize there's a challenge getting the ministry getting data from one of its departments, let's say from Kenya National Examinations Council, or even within the department, a person to get data in the system that he runs has to write a letter to the supervisor and the supervisor to the PS and to access that data. So it's quite a challenge, and that affects really how data flows. And let's we should also recognize that government is like the biggest custodian of the largest part of data on education. They are the ones who knows how many children are in school today as we speak here. So you can only get that data from them. So it is quite challenging when the power is not. Again, on one of the other issues that plays with those stakeholders is Do you trust the accountability part of it? Do you trust the process you use to correct the data? So I think if I share my data, people will expose my shortcomings in that data, the sample I used, the methodology. So I don't want to share that data with the stakeholder because I might be exposed. I think that's what I can say briefly around that. Otherwise, much of what has been observed across the country is similarly the same around in this country. Yeah, back to you, Nariman.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. And I'd invite Esme and Rigobert to come back on camera and to be all together in a conversation, and you, Charles, as well. Thank you all for mentioning things that are related to accessibility of data, trust, accountability. All of these are indeed barriers to accessing data and creating whatever we can call an effective data ecosystem. And we'll talk a little bit more about what this could be. I'm sure our audience have a lot of questions at the moment, as do I. So we will continue in conversation a little. I'll use my authority of being the moderator. For the rest of our audience, we will be continuing our conversation for a little of about maybe 20 more minutes before we open the questions up. But what I would like to encourage you all is that there is a Q&A function. You can find it on the banner below, besides your mic and video options. Please submit your questions as they come, as they're fresh. I'm sure as you are hearing our panelists speak, many questions are coming to your mind. Our colleague Latte from ESSA is already on these questions and will be fielding them to the panel as soon as we open up for questions and answers. Please write them as they come. So, speaking from these barriers and stakeholders in these different ecosystems, I think let's take a moment maybe to discuss the gaps in the research. What are the research gaps and what are the policy gaps regarding data generation, sharing, and use to be able to actually use this data effectively? So what are the research and the policy gaps regarding data generation, sharing, and use? I'll start with you, Esme, and then we'll go to Rigobert and then Charles. Maybe we can all just go after each other. I don't have to intervene again. You're muted, Esme.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Nariman. In terms of the gaps that exist in policy, in Malawi currently, we don't have a robust data management framework to regulate access of this data. That is why we have problems of accessibility of the data that is held by government, as well as lack of sharing of data amongst different stakeholders. And as we said already, there are issues of trust. Without that, framework to regulate how the data is accessed, people depend on their relationships to access the data. I think that was alluded to by Charles when he talked about that in Kenya, World Bank is able to access the data whilst the researcher gets that data from Ministry from World Bank. I think it's a similar situation in all countries. Because of that trust, because the developing partners, whether they're NGOs and donors are working closely with government, they are able to access the data, whilst researchers from university have to go through bureaucratic barriers to get that data. And also because of that, what we found in Malawi is that because of that, researchers, the academia, they are not aware what data is held by government. So actually during one of our stakeholder workshops, the first stakeholder workshops we had with government officials, NGOs, and academia, the head of EMIS at the ministry commented that he's always surprised that he reads work done by postgraduate students in Malawi, in the universities, and they collect the same data that is held by the ministry. So a postgraduate student might want to show trends in whatever problem they are researching, and they would go and collect from the schools, asking them 10 years back what was the situation. And yet, if they got that data from the ministry, they wouldn't have wasted their time collecting that data from schools, because that data is already within the ministry. But the reason why this is happening is because academics don't know what is held at the ministry, what kind of data. The data that is released by the ministry publicly in a bulletin is very limited. It only maybe analyzes 10% of the data. As such, government spends a huge amounts of money collecting data, and yet very little of that data is analyzed because it's the only stakeholder that is analyzing that data. Huge data amounts of data remain analyzed every year, and losing the potential of coming up with evidence that could be used by government to generate policy. And also, we need a clear policy on data sharing and use. Although the ministry claims that they have a system in place, that system is hardly known by the users. They don't know how they can ask the ministry for data because the ministry hasn't publicized the same to the public to say this is how you can access our data. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll just speak up from what Esme was talking about, that particular framework where everybody is working together, where we can have common data and share data, where we can access data from policymakers or from decision makers, from ministries. I mean, it's the same situation we are facing in Cameroon with our Ministry of Basic Education having like a sectoral AMIS that they call SIG. However, that data is not only limited, but it's also difficult to access. The challenge with that is that it encourages duplication because there are some researchers that will be, rather than just building on what is already existing, would be collecting data at fresh and also seeing their result not being integrated. So having like a repository or a framework where all these actors work together will be something that will be very important. There are a lot of gaps in terms of the type of data that the government is collecting, and also the timeliness of the data that is available. The state collects a lot of data, and mostly their data is around access to education, number of schools, number of students. But this data is collected from bottom to top, so right from the school to the ministry, and it takes some time. And they are also faced with a lot of technological challenges. So at times when this data comes, it is outdated. And this data could also leverage on data that is collected by CSOs, data that is collected by researchers working in universities, because they have some more in-depth insight into that data, some things that the government would not collect. For instance, data around the social and emotional well-being of a particular child in a particular school in a particular area. And that is something where building the common synergy or this common framework or repository is going to be very helpful to have a comprehensive data and a data ecosystem that works in favor of all the parties.
Yeah, in Kenya, the biggest gaps we see in this is the data itself. We have gaps in data, such that even when we look at what is existing, we still lack data on special needs education. That's very much showing that we don't have data on that. We are talking of the new curriculum, the competence-based curriculum. But when you mention it out here, it only talks about the normal, in quotes, the normal primary. It doesn't talk about special needs. The data itself also has gaps in gender. Foundational learning and numeracy cannot be gender neutral. And therefore, we need data to know whether these skills, including values and life skills, the socio-emotional skills, whether we have differences in that. So we have gaps in data itself. We also have gaps that can be classified as sharing gaps. One of them is the culture of I like calling it the policy oriented culture, where an institution will tell you we don't share data, but they don't have any written policy somewhere that says they can't share. But traditionally, they have never shared data, and therefore they feel like if you walk to Teacher Service Commission and ask the distribution of teachers by county, for example, so that you can map them against the children in this country, you are likely not to get this data, but not because it is illegal, but we do not share that data. Why do you need it and all that? And even if you request for that data, it can stay, that request can stay in limbo forever, like no response, nothing. So there is also the sharing. And in the sharing, we also need to talk about, if I wish that they give annual reports. For example, if we got products that package that data in a shareable format, look how central bank shares its data. It produces monthly, quarterly, annual reports. So you can actually track data. Imagine universities don't share reports. Therefore, you don't know how many students you have. Now, primary is even difficult. Then you even have a bigger problem when you are talking about pre-primary, what Rigobert is calling kindergarten. And so you only know when they do KCP, the terminal exam, or KCSE at Form 4. So we do not have products that can help us. So there is the issue of this data is not, there are gaps of sharing. Then there's also the issue of the use. Data is inert in itself. If it is just sitting there, it does not elicit value. It elicits value when it's shared. Now, we have gaps in the use. Even whoever is holding this data, think about the repositories we have that we mapped in the 3 countries. The university repositories first don't talk to each other. They don't talk to each other. Each university have a very nice repository, very nice, but it's just like the physical library. They just made it online. So we also have data with government departments, ourselves as NGOs, the CSOs, and the others, which we store in databases, but they don't talk to each other. So sometimes we replicate the same data, creating a gap of, I don't know what exists, what doesn't exist, what is true, what is not true. Sometimes data is not. I take, for example, as I close my comment, we've been saying from 2015 that children are not learning in Kenya. That is data existing. The Teacher Service Commission collects data on performance of teachers. That's another set of data. But I'm very sure, I would imagine, I can't say that confidently, but I would imagine that since they look at the performance of teachers perform very well when you look at their performance in their system. But when we say they perform very well, who are these children they teach who are not learning? So it is good if you were to interface this data and look at it side by side. When you say there are challenges of teachers not in certain areas for foundational learning, it's good to see where are the teachers. Where are they? How are they mapped against the children? Are they where they are not children? Are they where they are children? Classrooms, the same. This also the issue, the gap in a class that Rigobert talked about. In Kenya, the entry age to primary school is age 4, which is okay because that is PP1. But we have an informal, in quotes, class called baby class. That is age 3. We do not have very good data. And I don't think anybody is tasked to correct that data. We do not have that data on that because not every student, it's not legal and it's not illegal. We do not have data on that class. So, but children are learning, they are somewhere. So we have that kind of gap that we cannot really talk about it. And then there are the politics, of course. We can't miss to say that whoever holds data holds power. When you hold power, you control the narrative. So when you create a physical gap, you create a gap so that you control that power. You know where are the children. And I mean, so you create a gap artificially so that you control the narrative. how many classrooms to be constructed, how many teachers to be employed, how many. So that's also a gap, Nariman. Thank you.
Appreciate it to all of you. I think this is, there's a lot that's coming in. You've spoken about lots of power dynamics, who can access the data and who cannot, regulatory frameworks on data sharing that need to be clear and shared, common repositories. And you've also really highlighted how having this can help us, whether make more informed decisions about problems in gender education, problems in, the disparities in gender education, social emotional learning problems, teacher performance problems. So in a sense, you're actually talking that the effects of all of the gaps that exist, the mistrust and the accountability and the lack of sharing, is actually making us miss the point, is actually making us unable to solve the problem. The purpose at the end of the day is being lost, which is we have problems, but we're unable to solve them because we don't know the extent of these problems. And there's also a political side that you're all highlighting. You know, the more we do not know what the extent of the problem is and what its depth and, you know, how we compare it and contrast it with other connected problems, then we cannot create a narrative about what actually exists, or create a misplaced or a misguided narrative. Thank you all for highlighting this. I think you've all touched on stuff that's related to multi-stakeholder collaborations. So I will leave that more to more discussions in the questions and answers. And I'm going to more jump into, I feel like after speaking about all of these problems, we should speak a little about some of the lessons learned, some of the successes, some of the things that we've observed in our situation analysis is working. So what is actually working to leverage data for context-specific interventions in foundational learning? You know, maybe it's data from initiatives like Unlocking Data or other data initiatives. What is actually there when it comes to successes of foundational learning initiatives, or data for foundational learning initiatives in your 3 countries? I will start this time with Charles, followed by Rigobert, followed by Esme, if that's okay.
Yeah, what's working? I've seen that Patrick has also asked the same question. What is working? I mean, it's also not so fair to just be so grim and paint a very grim picture. I think there are some things that are working. For instance, we are seeing the government now changing the way they look at things and coming to request for, sometimes it is that they don't know what to do with that data. They don't know how to package it. They don't know how to, they don't have the capacity, let me say that they don't know, but they don't have the capacity to package it in those reports I'm talking about and other global public goods that can be shared. So I think what's working is, first of all, is to create champions and also to create communities that can come out, like use lateral learning, where you use a small group and tell them, because there has been a history, for example, in Kenya, where data is misused. Like CSO will take data to create a narrative to turn the people against the government, and therefore the government will feel like you want me to give you data so that you beat me up. And so the best thing is, can we help these people use their own data to make day-to-day decisions? Then they learn from each other. I have seen a situation where some counties have officers want to work with the county government officers together, and we help them come up with that. We're working on such kind of small scale, then scale that using them to teach the other counties that these guys are not interested in our data. Actually, this data is helping us, because we were asking them, the government officers in the field, we were asking them, if you do not know what data the county is correct, how do you plan for grade 1? If you don't know what they are correcting, yet you are sitting in the same county, how do you plan? So putting these together is one of the ways we are using to make sure that, one, they develop this common templates, and they also correct the data at the same time. So you won't say, oh, this was your data, let me correct mine. so that they can agree, when do we collect this data? So that when I need it, I can walk into Nariman's office and ask, can I have this data? We are seeing situations where if you are going to the county with this common template, you collect data from the lowest class to the highest class, such that you have harmonized data. The other way of doing this is helping them with the tools. Dashboards are rare and systems. They are rare with, especially with field officers. Therefore, including automating, correcting this data. When you're using paper and pen, but if you can really create dashboards where they can actually see the data from their desks as it comes in, it's easier to monitor, it's easier to know where we have problems and challenges. So I think that's one thing that we are approaching from this side from Kenya, and also talking to the NGOs. I've seen also a question like that. What is working? Opening up our data to micro data portals, so that also our data is accessible to our peers and to everybody. We can't be talking about data not being accessible, yet our data is also not accessible. So that's also something that's working. And then I think that's what I can say. I've seen it working. I know at least on my desk, we have 2 counties that have come out to say, help us here, help us correct data, help us manage this data that we have. What can we do with it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll definitely agree with Charles when he's saying that data system exists and that we should support them with capacity building and also with infrastructure to help them share it, things like dashboard and all the rest, things that are really working in Cameroon. So I'm looking at these data systems that are existing. The one the government is already using, the SEIG, and also this network of organizations working on foundational learning in Cameroon coming together to set the agenda, also to share knowledge, to share challenges, is also something that will work and that is working and that we can also leverage on. There is one key dynamic that I don't think we mentioned, is like who holds the money actually decides on the type of data and what data is actually being collected. So what these data system and these synergies of actuals can do is actually identifying a real type of data and outcome that is needed in each of these countries or in each of these sectors, and actually pushing for that particular outcome or that particular data to be harnessed. It's also something that we can leverage on. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Charles and Rigobert. I think what you have described, there are some similarities with what is happening in Malawi. 5-10 years, there have been a major focus in the education sector in Malawi on looking at foundational learning as a result of the poor learning outcomes. So government, with support of development partners, have initiated programs that are supposed to improve learning outcomes in the foundation learning years. So we have seen with the implementation of this, although some of the interventions are now on pilot, with development partners, doing things that have not happened before in terms of data generation and also data usage. And we are anticipating that in 5 years to come, we'll be talking of different things in relation to data usage and generation. So one of the things that is happening, there's one intervention that is being piloted in 2 districts where they are trying out to collect data at district level and use dashboards for the district in real time to use that data and make decisions at that level in real time. And also, there is literacy program, the new curriculum for literacy that is being developed in foundation years. Unfortunately, it was supported by USAID, so I don't know what will come of it, but they had started in the first 1.5 years they've been in operation, conducting district assessments and also school assessments, and using that data as well as collecting other data at the school and district level. And they've been using this data at that level in real time to actually impact on decisions that are made around the school and district. So this is one thing that was really a major gap in Malawi, that the data that the ministry holds emanates from the school level. But what we've been, what was happening, schools collect large amounts of data, send it to the zone, then the zone send it to the district send it to central ministry. None of the lower levels analyzes that data and uses the data to inform decisions at each of those levels. And they had to wait a year later for the ministry to produce the data and say, this is what is happening in your schools. So we are now seeing a shift where we are trying the data that is being generated at the lowest level before it's even sent to the central EMIS to be utilized at the school level to make certain decisions. So you've been to schools whereby you find distribution of teachers is heavily skewed towards the higher standards. And yet, they are doing that without realizing the impact that they are having on the foundational years. So the foundational years, despite that they have had poor outcomes, educational indicators, it has never moved the lower levels to do something about that situation. Similarly, at the higher levels, the minister reports high repetition rates every year for standard 1, and yet you see no interventions happening to tackle that problem that is happening. They are not using the data to actually inform policy decision that will reverse the poor learning outcomes at that level. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Esme, and thank you to all of you for actually giving us some concrete examples, whether of different platforms or different ways of disaggregating and working with data at sort of a school level, where decision-making can be a lot more effective and a lot more in real time. As we start opening up more questions from the audience, and to all the people who are submitting questions, thank you for all of them. Our team is looking at them, answering some and fielding others that we will take live in a moment. Please keep submitting your questions. I'm just going to open the floor for all three panelists to offer one thought, maybe in 1 or 1.5 minutes, so that we actually take audience questions, on the opportunities that exist. What are opportunities for more effective data ecosystems and equitable foundational learning from the mapping that you've done, from the challenges and the successes? What already actually exists and that we can capitalize on to reach the kind of the data ecosystem that we dream of? You could also take this chance to share your dream of what would an ideal data ecosystem look like and what opportunities exist. We'll take Charles, then Rigobert, then Esme.
Yeah, we have opportunities. For example, getting data on pre-primary readiness, on foundational literacy and numeracy. We have an exam called the KISRAT exam, Kenya pre-primary readiness exam assessment test. I mean, that's a very important opportunity to assess the level of readiness to primary education before children transit from PP2 to grade 1. That's a big opportunity that we can exploit data to actually tell us something. Another opportunity is at grade 3, that is age 8, where they do another KIPSEA. That exam just rises somewhere in the system, and it's not discussed within the school by teachers transiting now. We can tell they were here when they left pre-primary, and now grade 1, 2, and 3, what happened in between? Did they learn? Did they not learn? That's also an opportunity that we can use. We can leverage also on systems, interoperability of systems, interconnecting systems so that they are talking to each other is also an opportunity. I mean, we should take advantage of AI and all that, querying data. Like I should be able to query assessment data from NEC using just some tabs and get answers quickly. So those are opportunities that I see that pop up and low hanging that we can take advantage of. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I also, as Charles was speaking, I was also thinking at other data systems that exist and that we can also leverage on. I mean, beyond the ones that exist within the country itself, are like this international data system, like the PASEC in Cameroon or the MIES